This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
For our first session this year, we're doing one of these roundtables that we started doing last year, which we're trying to vary our formats and think about different ways to have these discussions. And I think the roundtables are a particularly productive way of varying our format. So today we have three very interesting speakers. The first is Mark Ravinder Frost, who's based at Essex. He's got a number of plates spinning in terms of research, one of which involves the popular experience of the Second World War in Asia, another one of which involves the port cities of Asia and the Enlightenment, the intellectual history, and another of which involves this kind of public history stuff, which I'm sure he'll tell you more about. Then we have Christopher Gerteis, I'm trying to murder that, sorry, who's based at SOAS, whose current project looks at Japanese corporations and the use of nostalgia to rewrite their own history. His work was circulated in advance for this work. And then we have our very own Naoko Shimazu, based at Birkbeck, whose current project is looking at Bandung, and through the perspective of the idea that diplomacy is theatre. And they're all going to speak for a little bit of time, and then we're going to have, hopefully, a very interesting discussion about public history. So I'll hand over to Mark.
Thanks very much. So Naoko, someone's going to give me the signal, right, at 20 minutes?
Yeah.
Yes. What I thought I'd do is I'd start, this is basically a series of informal remarks, beginning with definitions of public history. I think one of the readings that was sent around was Ludmilla Jordanova's chapter on that. Talk a little bit about my own personal story of how I became embroiled in public history when I was living in Singapore, and then move on to some of the possibilities I see in terms of public history in Asia as a future research agenda. It's a very timely moment for this discussion because Asia is certainly experiencing what the Yale historian Jay Winter would call a memory boom at this very moment. The Smithsonian earlier this year claimed that China was opening on average around 100 new museums each year. And if you were following The Guardian a few months back, you may have seen an article about the Jibaozhai Museum south of Beijing, which closed down after 2 years of opening because it was alleged 40,000, basically its entire collection was faked. Such was the pressure to create these new museums. So they're very interesting questions, these scandals aside, as to what is driving this memory boom at the moment. It's not confined merely to China. And in what ways public history is also conforming to global types, global forms in the presentation and ultimately the content of these memoryscapes, these public history spaces, becoming, if you will, part of a global heritage complex. This is something I had a personal experience of because of my involvement with a design company I'll speak about later, a Montreal-based design company called GSM Media and Design in Singapore, which set up in Singapore effectively to then branch out and get the China dollar and Malaysian and Indonesian to basically establish itself across the region. Another reason it's a timely discussion, and some of you will be very familiar with this, I'm going to repeat it anyway for the students who are not, is because of recent changes in academic life for a historian in the United Kingdom. I'm speaking about myself now being subject to a state-controlled funding research complex that encourages KE, knowledge exchange. As a historian mostly of Asia during the late colonial and decolonization periods, I am supposed to have impact. In my department, we still debate endlessly what impact means. We still get angry at the assumption that in our daily work within universities we don't have impact and we have to go beyond the university to have impact. At the same time, when I put in research projects, as I just have recently over this summer break, they go through an internal vetting process within perhaps it's the same everywhere, Essex is not unique, within the research and enterprise office they come back with messages impact deficient, or you need to ramp up, it's like a medical disease, you need to ramp up your KE, and I am forced to think about how I'm going to communicate my ideas beyond the academy? What sort of sixth form talks am I going to do? Is there a policy? How am I going to deploy and disseminate my research beyond the academy? Is there the possibility of public events, exhibitions, documentaries? So, as academic historians, we are all being pressed to communicate ideas in these new spaces and to embrace new genres, audiences, and the processes when we convey our insights. New processes, I mean. Yet often we don't know a great deal about what these translation efforts, if you will, entail and what these processes, these new audiences, these new genres actually do to the content of the history we originally sought to convey. And as I said, this is a subject close to my heart because I spent 4 years. I began as a postdoc in Singapore at the Asia Research Institute of the National University of Singapore, and then left academia for a while, although I was still affiliated with that institution, to work with the National Museum of Singapore as content designer for its Singapore History Gallery, some of the images of which are here. And in fact, the irony was, in terms of the shifting nature of academic history in this country, when I returned and went for a job at Essex, it turned out later I was told that I was seen to have impact, and this is something they were very keen on, and actually it turned around, whereas this departure from academia was now a positive thing on the CD. So let me get the ball rolling by first adding my 2 pence worth to the question of what public history actually is. After this, I'll talk a bit more about those experiences in Singapore, and if there's time, about future areas, I think, that research into public history in Asia opened up. Okay, let's begin with a quote. Public history, much like jazz and pornography, is easier to describe than to define, but you know it when you hear it or see it. These are the words of an expert in the field of public history in the United States from a few years back, and since then there have been many, and the whole subject has always been sort of dominated by back and forths over what we're actually talking about. I think I go along, albeit with some qualifications, with the gist of Ludmilla Jordanova's definition in her influential, for students especially, 2000 book History and Practice. This is almost like the departure lounge for many, many masters modules such as the one Essex is launching this year into public history. To some extent, the very category of public history has only emerged through and in tandem with the development of the academic discipline of history, arising from the need to distinguish the latter from that vast range of other ways in which people have long-fashioned representations of the past. What I'm saying is, up to the birth of the modern academic discipline of history in Western Europe in the early 19th century, we might say that all history was public history. There was no need to draw attention to its specifically public nature until history from within the ivory tower started to claim for itself a newfound discipline, rigour and scientific veracity. I also fully agree with Jordanova that we need to think of public history in terms of the vast array of processes, genres and conventions, all with their distinct rules of engagement that lie beyond the academy, and so reach a different, and thus reach a different, often much larger audience. The idea of public history spaces with their distinct audiences and conventions is particularly useful here, I think, since many academics, as I said, are today involved in genre crossing. They have to learn how to speak on radio or television. They recognise the need to be pithy. They now know what to do. They have to do in terms of their delivery to make it past the producer's final cut, the final edit. I'm also very aware from personal experience, as Jordanova argues, that public history is very often a history of emotions, a world which academic historians have not ventured into as often as they might. And lastly, there is no escaping the fact that public history is frequently usable history, and that's what Jordanova calls interested history, by which she means it seems forever subject to the influence of powerful interested parties, the foremost in her view being the nation-state. As she further points out, and as several people before her have argued who've written on the heritage industry, for example, or nostalgia, Public history, it should not be forgotten, is also a commercial undertaking, a business. As such, its production is subject to market forces and consumer expectations. I particularly, as someone who worked in museums, and before I worked for the National Museum of Singapore, I really did not enjoy most museums. I particularly appreciated her description of museums that work in insidious ways to present a past that is highly refined in the manner of manufactured foods. This is one of the things you appreciate if, as an academic, you step across the divide to become a public history practitioner and discover everything you present being placed in front of a selection panel, which, like judges in a talent contest, determines whether it will be of general interest, whether it will entertain, whether it has the wow factor to keep an audience with a limited attention span looking or seeing or listening. So public history, we might therefore conclude, as a term, a category that captures the academic community of historians looking from within at the way the wider world does and experiences history, acknowledging the gulf between their own discipline and popular perceptions and presentations of the past, which sometimes are seen to be ill-disciplined. At the heart of this category is a clear binary, one that contains, even in Jordanova's valuable discussions, certain assumptions that we might want to unpick. I, for instance, would sound a note of caution as to the presumption that academic history is in practice somehow immune from political interests or indeed free from the influence of external forces I've just outlined. Many of us here, of course, are students of Asia. We know the work of Edward Said. What is more, it could be argued that these days academic historians are no more immune to the wider marketplace than in any other industry. In Essex, we sit every year and we look at bums on seats and undergraduate modules, and therefore, as many of us know, this actually shapes the kind of history we are doing. And economic history has certainly seen a decline since we realised our students do not like economic history, and cultural social history and stories are the way forward. But generally, as we know, what we research and present as history within an academic context is not as yet determined by its power to entertain and draw a popular audience. Although if we do impact, increasingly that might be the case. Where I'd go further than Jordanova, who was writing over a decade ago, is on the matter of public history genres, which seem to be multiplying. And this is a very interesting aspect of the digital revolution. Teaching a module on the British Empire in the Indian Ocean last year, I was trying to summarise the British conquest of Bengal in mid-18th century India, when one of my students, who usually looks out the window and tends to zone out, suddenly came to and with a gasp said, "I fought these wars." Now, he wasn't having a past life moment, but he was referring to his virtual life, his experience of the Sega video game Total War Empire. This was his history. He got terribly excited, and then he knew an awful lot about it. So this kind of expansion, the multiplying of spaces, is a particularly interesting one, and one I think further research could explore. Where I also diverge a little bit from Jordanova's introduction to this subject, is in her claim that the state lies at the heart of public history. And sometimes I think this unnecessarily limits our scope. Non-state, non-profit groups and individuals surely deserve to be given a prominent place in the study of public history, especially in an Asian context, not least because often without state patronage, and sometimes because they don't have state patronage, they do reach considerable audiences. I'm thinking of the amateurs Jordanova refers to, the local history societies, the heritage organisations, the reenactment boffins, the part-time tour guides, even the founders of independent boutique museums, etc., who are all creating their own narratives and creating publics for those narratives. However, I think generally the discussion we had was a good one and a good point from which to depart. So I'll turn to my experiences with the Singapore History Gallery in between 2005 and early 2007. Apart from needing a job, the reason I chose to work with the National Museum of Singapore, I think, throws up some of the ways in which the changing nature of this public history, academic history divide, this binary, if you will, shifts and changes as we move out of those self-styled Western liberal democratic contexts and into other different academic and political contexts. In Singapore, I was working in a university subsidised by what is often referred to as a benign authoritarian regime. Academic history was very academic. I joined a research institution designed to boost the National University of Singapore's international research credentials in the humanities, but found myself, for various reasons, unable to teach. And being unable to teach students is one of those things you only realise how wonderful it is when it's taken away from you. Most of the time we complain, and to not have that impact was certainly affected me. And particularly as I got more interested in Singapore history, the sense of being in an academic bubble, of being a little bit irrelevant, being married to someone who was born in Singapore, having 3 children there, started to play on my mind. I was feeling a bit impact deficient, if you will. And I remember discussing distinctly with the then director of the Asia Research Institute what our approach was going to be as international scholars to the question of criticising the People's Action Party, of addressing aspects of Singapore's history, societies and politics which were perhaps deemed out of bounds, which were sensitive, was often the term that is employed still to this day there. And what was very clear was within an academic context, we pretty much had free rein. This was where the divide became very clear. And we started to wonder, so what point do we become public? If we published in academic journals, if we held conferences and workshops on campus, this was clearly academic history. If we went and talked to media outlets, especially international media outlets, if we took this work somewhere else into a different space that was beyond that world, then we were on dangerous ground. The spatial border, the division between public and academic and public history was actually a very real and politically significant one. And in this state of mind, so I made what might seem a very bizarre decision to go and work with the very Singapore government that had, in a sense, restricted the outlets for my research, if I so chose, to make it more public. And one of its, and at least not the government, at least its heritage offshoot, the National Heritage Board, in the production of a Singapore history gallery, and a sort of a huge monolith to national narratives. And I think I probably still to this day need to do some explaining as to why that decision was made. I have to say I was attracted by the iconoclastic possibilities of what was then being planned for the National Museum of Singapore, the reopening, the revamp in 2006 with this shiny new Singapore History Gallery, some of which you can see here. The museum came to me via the consultancy firm GSM Design and basically said, along the lines of, well, the designers certainly said, they don't have a great deal of collection. They certainly don't have a wow collection such as other museums have. So they decided to adopt a storytelling approach focused on people, on life stories, with the collection to be utilised as dramatic props, as it were, as a way of bringing people into a world populated by individuals rather than people rather than things. And the museum is going to utilise massive amounts of multimedia. Visitors are going to navigate their way, and they do, through the galleries through use of headphones and an iPod-like device. It's now become a tablet called the Companion. In this way, visitors would approach an object or walk into a set made from historical objects, real and created, press a button, and then listen on their device to the dramatic episode that space was designed to convey. The history gallery was going to be largely a walking, interactive radio play, but there are also many spaces where visitors could watch short films and footage. The way this digital media fest was sold to the government at the time, I believe, was in very practical terms. One of the problems for any National Museum of Singapore is that there are 4 official languages, and there simply isn't often the space to do captions in Chinese, English, Malay and Tamil. And so therefore the digital device was the way of getting around that. But what I was really impressed by was when the designers, GSM Media, told me of the museum's plan to allow people to have 2 pathways through this history. And at that time, the 2 pathways were called, I think, the main path and the personal path. They later became known as the events path and the personal path. And this suddenly it was an enticing, opened up enticing possibilities. The fact that you could have a narrative that effectively did national education, so the school children go through and see all the big events, the heroes and villains that Jordanova has a problem with in many museums, quite rightly. But you also had a possibility of a subaltern corrective. You also had this other history, and you could cross-reference. You could move between the two. I'll come back to that because I think it was one of the moments of genius of the museum in terms of those who originally came up with the idea. The other point with using this multimedia was the possibility of using huge numbers of oral histories to create a museum that, freed from the demands of a sort of world-renowned flashy collection, became effectively a shifting, changing memory box. We put forward the idea of history as a multiplicity of voices, using microbiographies, microhistory, if you will, to open up windows into much more complex social, political, historical structures and processes. The iPod, because of its memory, seemed to have a seemingly limitless scope. We ended up taping 9 hours of English language material, and you can access all of that. You can go back again. And now there are versions in Japanese, Malay, Chinese, and Tamil. You could get into whole new levels of depth and immersion if you so wished. So for those who really wanted a more sophisticated history, we interviewed several of the leading experts who happened to be in Singapore during this period on Singapore history and Southeast Asia and the broad Asian region. And you can go to what are called little zoom-out corners, and you can hear interviews that almost take you away from the personal events, take you away from the agency of the individual to look at the broader structures. And this is all there. Again, I think I'll come back to it. I think politically there is something subversive about the gallery. It invites, the companion device invites, and this is very popular in Singapore today, the visitor to be a consumer of history, and they have choice, or they feel they have choice. And they have quite a lot of choice, 9 hours of material to choose from. Those who want a state-led history of Singapore can meander down the events path. Those who want to depart this familiar territory can wander off into places where they hear voices and accounts up to a point from the other side. The museum thus presents both a straight-approved nationalist history of Singapore and at the same time, in certain spaces, a contestation of that. Digital media also allowed us, and I think this is crucial in the way that academic history and public history can intersect, it allowed us to be transparent about what we were doing. We footnoted everything. We footnoted every source. If you heard a voice of Raffles, we had the source. If we made up a voice based on James Warren's books, on Kariuki-san or whatever, we cited where this came from, and we put it all out there. Unfortunately, I don't think anyone's that interested. I think the museum's now stuck it on the website. We could have gone further with the visual references, because we did a lot of research into how these designers built the sets, and we went into the URA, the Urban Renewal Authority, and dug up old pictures of shop houses. We could have done that too. But basically everything you hear has that kind of that footnoting, that referencing, which allows us transparency to get away from what Jordanova calls that insidious production of history that occurs within museums. The stories have a provenance in the same way the objects do. So I took away, how much time have I got left? 5 minutes, yeah. I took away from this process several things which I'll briefly try to summarise, and perhaps we can follow up in the discussion. As I said, this was a public history that was on the surface, unless you went to hear the zoom-outs and you heard Professor Wang Gangwu or Tony Reid or someone talking about the bigger picture. This was a history of emotions. There was a great emphasis on history as experience. Not so much history, causation leading to events, but how those events then have the ripple effect on individuals and then cause further events. And genres, as Jordanova says, really do dictate the way you present history in this particular public history context. She mentions the need in narrative historical fiction for closure. And even in these micro-histories, you needed closure. And sometimes this got us into interesting situations. One of my favourite episodes researching, when you're able to sort of look at things you're looking in an academic context and then translate it, was into the life of a Malay journalist and sort of proto-nationalist figure, Yunus Abdullah, in Singapore. And we dug out his verbatim, really, speeches and the response from the Legislative Council hearings where he was arguing the case for more English education for Malay boys. And what's nice about those transcripts is you have little mentions of the laughter, the jokes, the clapping. So we just staged it. We got 2 actors to do this job. And we needed an endpoint. And the reality is the discussion goes on and the colonial regime did not listen. But ours ends with the rousing moment where Yunus says what is said and the Asian journalists and others in the audience clap him and he cheers. In a way, we were catching a really subjective moment of answering back, of writing back. And the justification was that was the purpose, the emotional content of that episode. If you really wanted to find out, and you could, about how colonial policy actually undid all these, made a mockery of these attempts, you'd find that in other parts of the gallery. So you always were having to come up with 3 acts and coming up with closure in the use of these micro-histories. These micro-biographies. I also, in another way, which has certainly affected my research, was very struck by the way I was so paper document dependent. And I came into this wonderful research project involving and given a huge team of experts in Chinese and Malay and people who could read Jawi Malay, unlike me, and all these kind of wonderful things, and resources to go into all the archives and dig up as much as we could. And we were after visceral history. And something that struck me, certainly looking at the history of nationalism, the history of decolonisation in Asia, is how much we overplay print capitalism, we overplay text, and we need to look at music and song and film and all these very many other ways as historical sources and bring them in. I was particularly struck by the communist folk songs, which in the end actually we didn't use, and it wasn't a political reason. It was couldn't get the licensing, we couldn't get the money for the licensing fee to use them. But struck by their power and how interesting it would be to look at these, look at how decolonisation was sung or nationalism was sung, listened to, watched, performed, as well as read. I also came away with a very strong sense of how contingent any academic historians, how contingent the whole process of public history is, how your involvement in it, in writing academic history, you can claim authorship, you can hope that the book is going to appear and stay in some academic library, although who knows now with budgets whether that will be the case. To discover, first of all, that this was not the case, that you design a space and then collections taken out, things are shifted around. The leader of an island in Singapore may die soon. The whole history gallery may be removed to make way for a kind of mausoleum history of the founding father. You become aware of all these, contingent factors involved in the process. You also become aware of the way an analysis of these spaces, sometimes carried out within academia, assumes that everything is constructed. It's a bit like sometimes I feel when, having crossed over the divide, people sometimes say if people are somewhat away, see the conspiracy because they were away from the process, in a way, or away from the political process or whatever else. In this context, it was very clear things happened to do with practical measures. Lighting was a problem, and then we had this final gallery where we could light it properly because the collection for once was strong enough to withstand the light. And then I read a wonderful piece talking about the whole lighting of the gallery and how it finally comes into the PAP, the party wins the election 59, and it's enlightenment. Another space was the opening space. This, if you see just up here, this weird big cylindrical, can't remember what we called it, our tunnel, which was our Singapore Today, and we were supposed to bring out themes of mobility, of Singapore being a hub, all these things, and then elements that you'd then see the history of. And that was very well lit in its first instance, and this is kind of big attempt at it's a pastiche of that wonderful documentary with the name Pauakatsi, is it? Yeah, Pauakatsi. It was a pastiche of that. It's got Philip Glass type music, and unfortunately, the producers saved money on the projectors, so they began to fail. They began to go weak. And then I had someone writing me saying that I loved this primordial swampish opening, rather than a celebration of Singapore. It was all murky and dark, and it wasn't actually. It was supposed to be bright and glaring. It's very interesting how much people will misread and not misread. They will lay on their own levels of meaning things that I thought were ironic, were ambivalent, were seen as triumphalist. All these kind of things you become aware of. So the interplay of audience with exhibit is one of those fascinating areas. And finally, just to wrap up, I really got a sense of where future directions in academic research into public history in Asia might go. Globalisation was ever apparent in the making of this history gallery. As I said, it was part of GSM Design, a Montreal-based company that was looking to expand, bringing with it a particular experience and a particular aesthetic. It's very interesting to what extent museums across the Asian region, at least in Southeast Asia and East Asia, are now in some ways conforming to this globally recognised visitor aesthetic, design aesthetic and visitor experience. We were in competition, of course, with Applebaum and Associates, people who did the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, which has then impacted on Nanjing War Memorial Hall and the Memorial Hall in Nanjing and various other places. And that aesthetic minimalism, the way people commemorate past tragedies and suffering, and all this language is in a way converging. In some ways, there's a commodification of remembrance that is occurring. And one of the things is, when you're working with Montreal-based designers and you're trying to say, I want this, that looks silly. And you're trying to give them visual materials to do something that is somehow going to resonate better with a Singaporean audience. And they have one mind on how it's going to look within a global design world. And you can't do that because it's a very interesting process. And these consultants, such as I was, we stay in the background. You know, we get paid and we go and do these things. And you don't obviously see maybe in where we're active. You know, for various reasons, you sort of you take the money and stay quiet, but it'd be interesting to trace some of these flows, these transnational flows across Asia. Also, the regional aspect was very powerful. The transnational regionalism that was taken into account within the making of the museum. The Singapore National Museum, the History Gallery, when we were designing it, the curators were very keen on the Japanese audience. So we ended up doing an 8-hour translation of the original English script that was recorded in Tokyo for that audience. And we also had a lot of discussions about how we're going to present World War II. How are we going to do this? And the key thing that these audiences needed to be brought in, they needed to be involved, in some ways educated, but ultimately they had dollars. There's a kind of increasing transnational flow of tourists and therefore of money. Visa restrictions have been eased. There's various factors why this memory boom is being driven in a way by transnational forces. And that means that a site which is supposed to be a nationalist memoryscape, or had been in the past, becomes transformed. There's more layers of meaning now going on. I find this very interesting. I'm going to wrap up with this. I think it's a very interesting point because so much of what has been written about, certainly of East Asia and public history, and certainly on war remembrance, has gone back to the textbook controversies, has gone back to national education efforts. And all sorts of things are happening at the level of museums that are trying to draw out that wider regional audience, and also the level of non-state actors. People are making their money from reconciliation tourism. Tour guides are giving all sorts of interesting narratives, providing them in war pilgrimages to Vietnam, to Japan, to all these sort of places. Possibilities of post-conflict reconciliation, perhaps, outside of the state narrative. So then again, I just come back to the point. I think public history has to certainly take into account the non-state actors and their relationship with the state, the impact of globalisation, the impact of transnational mobility, and the fact that the state often, and this was certainly the case in Singapore, has certain messages it wants embedded for its own citizens, but also wants to make money. The power of capital, global capital, shifts in global capital in reshaping nationalist and narratives. Okay, finish there.
Thanks, Mark. Wow, that's really hard to follow. I don't even know how to begin because it's so right. and right on. It sounds like a great museum, which is interesting because I hate history museums. And maybe I can get a chance to talk to you more about it in the future. I do want to underscore the point that Mark made at the beginning, and I think it's particularly important for those of us in UK academia who are judged by the academic authorities to have impact, to criticize the notion of impact. And I think it's patently ridiculous, the hoops that we are being forced to jump through in order to somehow justify what we do as university researchers and university instructors. And I say that as someone who has a very high impact score as a consultant on Hollywood motion picture films, locally produced documentaries, and video games. Right? And I still think that they need to just leave us alone and let us do what we do best, which is educate and research. Anyway, so enough of the political statement. I'm sorry, Naoko, to do that, but Mark started it. It's his fault. I am engaged in a book-length project looking at the problem of history production, something that I consider sort of an enterprise. And I'm particularly interested in how private organizations, for and not for profit, reshape public memory and institutional history into marketable goods and services, thus making history into a privately owned commodity with all of the property rights guaranteed by law and by custom. And what that means for us as professional historians, but also for people broadly. I'm looking particularly at company histories and how they're repackaged in industrial heritage, and thus the development of heritage tourism in Japan as part and parcel also with economic redevelopment in peripheral areas that have been hard hit by deindustrialization. And within that, how interest group politics shape public history as presented by private organizations, both for and not for profit. And what Naoko asked me to talk a little bit about today is the subject of the talk that I gave here in this seminar last year. If you missed it, I'm sorry, and I can't reproduce it because there's serious time constraints. But I'm looking at part of the heritage boom that we're looking at worldwide, and sort of the UNESCO World Heritage Site competition. Everyone's going to be a World Heritage Site, and indeed, it is looking like these sites in Kyushu will receive authorization, certification as World Heritage Sites as part of the new definition of what we call industrial heritage. And in the process of doing this study, I had the opportunity to go and do a month of field work with the prefectural office and the local volunteers who are in the process of producing this narrative. There's an initial narrative that was produced by a committee, and now they're in the process of setting up the sites, because most of these had, like many archaeological sites, disintegrated and almost entirely disappeared, and in some ways don't even exist. They're going to have to be remanufactured. Oddly enough, those most protected are the ones least accessible, still sitting on functioning industrial sites, and there's no access because of safety concerns. That there's shipbuilding facilities that are still building ships, that have been building ships since the 1880s and haven't stopped. There are steel production facilities that are still producing steel. Unlike industrial heritage in England, where it's very easy to get access to an industrial heritage site because deindustrialization has proceeded so much further. I should add that I got interested in this particular topic as a labor historian. That my first book touched on one part of this region, the city off to the left, Arao and Uki and Omuta are the site of the Miike mine, which is the site of a major strike in 1953 and again in 1960. And as I was constructing my first book, which is a labor history, I spent a lot of time with those archival sources, all based in Tokyo, where the Central Union and Central Company archives were based. And because of budget constraints, I never had the opportunity to actually go to these sites. And so everything that I had known about this strike was through documents and oral interviews with people who had moved north and left the area because the mines had closed. And so as I started thinking about a next project, I said, well, I really want to go to Kyushu. What can I do in Kyushu? And I started looking at the mines, and I realized that the mines, which had been closed, were being reopened as theme parks. And I said, wow, there's something there, and I need to look into that. Wow, okay, well, we'll get there. It's all part of a regional initiative to reconstruct local history that is, on the surface, an initiative led by the prefectural government of Kagoshima. And it's all built around this idea of the men who made modern Japan. And that this notion that Japan was sort of that Kyushu, this island, was the heart of industrialization, which, there's legitimacy to this claim, but I immediately take objection to this notion that the men who make modern Japan and that the elite notions, et cetera, et cetera. And my narrative, as I'm examining it, look at three centers of this narrative. One being the far southern city of Kagoshima, the other being a fairly well-known city, but the harbor of Nagasaki, in which rests a very important island that was a mine, a coal mine, and the Omudarao area, which I originally mentioned, which is the center of the Miike mine. And so in that sense, most of my story is about mines and mining heritage. But it's not the most important part, even though it's actually the most interesting part, in the sense that how one reconstructs the history of mining is terribly politicized. But when that history is reconstructed by the mining company itself, as part and parcel with the official history of the company, on the land still owned by the company, maintained by volunteers from the OB Association of the retired people who are still drawing their pension from the company, what part of this is public history? Especially when the prefectural governments are deeply invested in it to the point of reproducing their own local fifth grade curriculum around that narrative. And that comes primarily from an initiative that began in Kagoshima. Indeed, and I'm going to sum this up in 3 minutes, and so I'm going to talk really fast. And I apologize for that. The city of Kagoshima is where this whole bid for UNESCO World Heritage started. And it started in a conversation between two descendants of the hereditary baron of the prefecture, who are still deeply invested in government. Now, the aristocracy was military aristocracy that they are descendant of was abolished in Japan in 1873. They have no aristocratic status, but that family still dominates the city of Kagoshima and the prefecture of Kagoshima, which is the former Satsuma Han. And as they brought forward the idea of redeveloping the industrial sites around Kagoshima as World Heritage sites, in part by bringing some consultants in from the UK, they also approached the city government for a large loan to bail out the family's tourist enterprise. So while simultaneously promoting World Heritage, the family is also using its influence. Hey, look at this great idea. Oh, by the way, our golf course is about to go bankrupt. And that castle that we own that everyone loves to go to because of the garden might have to be redeveloped as condominiums. And the Shimazu family, I'm sorry, Naoko, there may or may not be a relation. The Shimazu family has thus constructed this history of Japan's modernization, and partly through this museum, but also through video. There's a video game, there's a film, as well as local school tours to the garden, around this notion of modern heritage as embodied by the hereditary lords of a domain that hasn't existed for a long time, through their ability to directly influence the contemporary government of the prefecture of Kagoshima. And through this also, they've received considerable funding to develop for the last 5 years now the 5th grade history textbook for regional history of Kagoshima, centered around the Shimazu family and their central role in the industrialization of Japan, which is not necessarily fraudulent, but there are key aspects of this story that they do not explore, like the very difficult relationship that the clan had as the overlords of Ryukyu, the kingdom of Ryukyu, which now you would know as Okinawa, the complicated relationships through Ryukyu that they had with China and Korea, the exploitation of so-called guest workers from Korea and China during World War II who were used to mine these mines, to work in these factories. These things don't come up, of course, in the official public history state, but they certainly don't come up as part of the private history narrative sold to the tourists. Whether it should or not doesn't matter. It is possible to tell negative stories and still draw large numbers of tourists. You look at Chong'ek or at the slave markets of colonial Williamsburg, where negative stories, ghastly and gruesome, draw very large numbers and yet still educate in some fashion. So I think I'm done because I've used all of my time, but I'm very interested in how these tropes that are deployed are reshaped and refashioned and then ultimately protected by lawyers. And that it's a very real issue that once these stories have been constructed and trademarked, they become property that's owned and defendable. Whether it's slander or not doesn't matter, but how do you access a story or criticize a story once it's been repackaged as such, especially since these companies sit on their archives and control access, but they also control use of representative photographs and who you can talk to, whether they're retired or not, is carefully controlled by the economic circumstances of these private history enterprises. Okay, anyway, thank you very much. I'm going to turn this over to Naoko.
You can stay here.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Because I'm going to ask the two main speakers to stay, because I see my role as essentially being a discussant. I'm not presenting any piece of work myself, but I think it's actually been tremendously interesting for me to listen to Mark's sort of personal stories, because I've always wanted to do this, and I may be one of the very few people who actually went through every single option. The National Museum of Singapore. Yeah, it took me, I think, about 4 or 5 visits, about 3-4 hours each, and I pushed every single thing. So somebody actually did go through them, and I think you must be. I know I'm really boring, aren't I? No, it's okay. We're actually recording this, but we're going to end when my comments end, because that's the sort of formal part of the presentation, and then we'll switch it off so that you can really let rip in your discussion part. Mainly because I was astonished by the amount of information that the exhibits through this sort of system of keying in numbers, and you can get as much or as little information as you want. And I think it must have been one of the most informative National History Museum or sections that I've ever been to. So I don't know whether you feel very happy about my comments on that one or not. But anyway, what I wanted to raise are sort of like 3 points, really. One is going back to this idea of this very sort of basic thing about the definition itself of what is public history, because we heard two very interesting examples of what constitutes public history. So it seems to me that we are dealing with some kind of history, that's for sure, but this public part is maybe the problematic part, because on the one hand, Mark's talk was very much about the sort of Singaporean national story of how they came about as a nation state, and then Chris's story was about this sort of very interesting mixture of corporate as well as municipal government authorities, local chambers of commerce, all sorts of different bodies getting together to create a version of public history, I guess, which involves a very powerful local family as well. So and also I think I don't know, maybe we can talk about this, but public history as a term in the UK is, I think, relatively new, isn't it? Whereas in America, if you look at the American Historical Association pages, it's been there for absolutely ages. And also, so how do we define public? And I sort of went to their sites. And in America, they have this thing called the National Council of Public History. And I think Weibo, that's his name, isn't it? The guy who, the web link, Weibo. He sort of seems to indicate that it is something that's created for the public. It's a history that's created for the public. But if you look at the British Historical Association's definition of public history, they say things like it's something that involves the public, both in terms of creation and in consumption. So I think there is actually a difference between these two different kinds of perspectives. Maybe I was just reading too much into this, but I think that's my first sort of point, is that who is involved in it? Is there one definition, or maybe there are multiple definitions? But it seems to be it's quite unclear as to what it is. Is it everything that is not academic history? Or what? And I think particularly with your mention of all these technological and game industry and all these, they have lots of history themes, don't they? Mm-hmm. And is that also public history or not? Now the second point is actually about the displays or the content of what is contained in whatever public history that we may come across. Because one of the things that I understand from these two presentations, as well as the other things that's been written about public history, is the fact that there is some kind of authorial intent in creating a version of history for public consumption or with the public or what have you. So you create something, right, with substance in it. But there is also the immediate question of reception, because you are dealing directly for the public and with the public and so on and so forth. So what is this sort of when we kind of involve so-called the public, does it immediately lead to things like public history being almost equivalent to collective memory? Like some kind of form of creation of collective memories, or some kind of collective past that emotional or emotive appeals are made in order to sort of somehow forcefully connect people to a particular version of the past. So there is the relationship between what is actually shown as public history and the intent of the authors in writing or displaying or creating that particular version of of history, and then the reception that people may have in terms of looking at these things. And I think that's a very complicated relationship, which is not at all clear. And from I think what you both say, that they don't, the intentionality and the reception do not often meet. And then lastly, it's to do with this. Politics of public history. There are lots of variables that affect the creation of public history, and I think Mark's experiences indicated quite a lot of factors which we, when we actually go and see this Singapore story, are not aware of, but very interesting sort of background factors. But also in Chris's case, there is a very strong, notion of, who is funding all this? Where is it coming from? And so, funding issues and also political interventions, particularly if it's a national history type presentation, then obviously there will be some kind of political agenda of the state. How do we deal with these things? Anyway, and I think maybe last we could just sort of think about the role of academic historians in all this, as we are, I suppose, ostensibly here as academic historians. So it will be very interesting to open up a discussion for that. Thank you. So, yeah.